welcome to the channel. If you enjoy captivating stories and intriguing content, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss an update. Also, drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from. I love seeing the amazing places our community comes from. Thanks for being here, and let's dive in. The flickering lights of Enron Plaza. The early Houston morning felt oddly hushed outside the gleaming 50-story tower on Smith Street. From a distance, Enron Plaza looked like success solidified, curtains of glass flashing in the sunrise, the company logo burning electric blue on the crown. Inside, however, the bulbs had begun to flicker. Whispers crept along hallways, rustling cubicle walls like a draft no engineer could trace. People spoke in half sentences, the numbers, another partnership, Arthur Anderson will handle it, before lowering their voices around the corner. Jeffrey Skilling's name still drew awe in the elevators. He had convinced traders that gas contracts could be transformed into living, breathing financial products. Kenneth Lay, meanwhile, floated through shareholder meetings like a genial host, promising a revolution in energy. Employees repeated the mantra. Enron wasn't just selling electricity, it was inventing the market of the future. The stock chart soared like a rocket leaving Earth's pull. Office legends claimed secretaries who stashed 401(k)s in Enron shares could now buy beach houses on Galveston Island. Yet on the 23rd floor, an accountant named Sharon Watkins saw something the markets didn't. She studied spreadsheets in the dim glow of a desk lamp, numbers marching across columns like soldiers compelled to salute. Revenue ballooned quarter after quarter, but cash flows never seemed to catch up. The difference looked small at first, the sort of glitch resolved with a footnote. Then it widened, tens of millions, hundreds, until the gap yawned like a canyon. She traced the discrepancy to a series of opaque partnerships with exotic names. LJM, Choco, Raptors. Each entity supposedly took risk off Enron's books. Miraculously, losses evaporated the moment a contract moved across the hall and into one of these shells. The deception relied on a trick of distance. Investors thought they saw clear, audited statements. In truth, they observed a reflection inside a reflection, like mirrors angled in an amusement park maze. The partnerships borrowed money using Enron stock as collateral, then used the cash to buy underperforming assets from Enron itself. Assets that would have sunk the quarterly numbers. Because Enron controlled the partnerships, accounting rules required the debt to stay in-house. But the company classified them as independent, shoving liabilities off stage while the bright lights shone on profits. Watkins drafted a memo to Lay, the chairman she once admired. She feared retaliation but feared silence more. The memo began gently, "I am incredibly nervous that we will implode in a wave of accounting scandals." It landed on his desk, yet no sirens blared, no emergency board session convened. Lay ordered the law firm Vinson & Elkins to conduct an objective review, narrowly scoped to ensure no explosives would be found. The review concluded management could have been clearer, but nothing illegal appeared. The flickering bulbs dimmed further. Markets reward confidence until they don't. In mid-2001, journalist Bethany McLean published an article in Fortune titled, "Is Enron Overpriced?" She posed the question everyone inside privately pondered. How did an energy trader earn profits dwarfing old guard utilities? Analysts shrugged. The stock dipped, bounced, then slipped again. Skilling, the architect of Enron's trading engine, resigned suddenly that August, citing personal reasons. Outside observers wondered, why abandon a rocket mid-flight? Autumn brought chill winds. Credit rating agencies eyed the off-balance sheet debt and downgraded Enron's bonds. Lenders demanded collateral the company could no longer supply because the collateral was, circularly, its own deflating stock. Debt covenants snapped like dry twigs. The partnerships, designed to bury losses, instead surfaced them in one violent plume. On October 16, Enron announced a $638 million quarterly loss and a $1.2 billion reduction in shareholders' equity. By Halloween, the once unthinkable word bankruptcy floated in trading rooms. Employees watched their retirement accounts evaporate on glowing screens, years of loyalty reduced to cents a share. Some wept at their desks. Others yanked framed certificates from cubicle walls, stuffing boxes before security badges failed. Just after Thanksgiving 2001, the company filed for Chapter 11. It was the largest corporate bankruptcy in U.S. history at the time. The glass tower still reflected sunrise, but inside, floors stood abandoned, computers powered down, nameplates removed. Investigators untangled the web. Arthur Anderson, Enron's auditor, had earned lucrative consulting fees while rubber-stamping creative accounting. The firm shredded mountains of documents once subpoenas loomed, an act as futile as erasing footprints in wet cement. Fragments remained, and so did email trails. Congressional hearings televised Lay raising a hand for the oath, Skilling explaining mark-to-market, accounting in a tone that suggested critics were simply unschooled. Ultimately, juries convicted Skilling of conspiracy and fraud. Lay was found guilty as well, though he died before sentencing. Watkins, initially dismissed as alarmist, testified as whistleblower. Arthur Anderson collapsed under a criminal conviction later overturned on appeal, too late to revive its reputation. The fallout rewrote regulations. Congress passed the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, tightening oversight of public companies, compelling CEOs to certify financial statements under penalty of prison. Yet regulations rarely capture the human dimension, the casual conversations, the subtle peer pressure, the way optimism becomes obligation. At Enron, young traders drank after work, boasting of asset-light strategies, never asking where the profits truly came from. Managers ignored uneasy questions, then repeated them as gospel to the next audience, each layer convincing itself the layer above had checked the math. In that sense, the fraud was not a single lie but a chorus, harmonized across floors until no dissonance could be heard. Today, the tower is leased by other firms. The blue logo is gone. If you stand across the street at dawn, you might still marvel at the architecture, the sun playing on glass. The building keeps its secrets, but the flicker in the lights is gone, replaced by a steady glow as though stability itself were a silent memorial to hubris. Beneath the lobby marble, somewhere in the wiring, remains the echo of trades never made, profits never earned, and the lesson that a company can soar high enough to blind itself before the fall becomes inevitable. Ghosts in the servers of Wirecard Munich. A mild April drizzle tapped against the glass facade of Wirecard's headquarters in Askim, a quiet suburb east of Munich. Commuters hurried past the sleek, low-slung building without guessing that inside, a multi-billion-euro secret pulsed like a hidden electric current. Wirecard AG billed itself as Europe's answer to Silicon Valley, a payment processor that could turn any smartphone tap into instant money. Investors loved the story, a German tech champion poised to outstrip PayPal. The share price glided upward in perfect, logarithmic calm. Markus Braun, the Austrian chief executive, cultivated a monk-like aura. He favored black turtlenecks, spoke of frictionless global commerce, and insisted the future belonged to those who made cash invisible. His public talks were airy clouds of optimism. In private, he demanded unblinking loyalty. On earnings days, he stood beneath soft studio lights, reciting numbers with the repose of a concert pianist. Revenue up, margins strong, acquisitions pending, always a step ahead of the curve. Yet one figure received more applause than any other, the mysterious third-party acquiring business in Asia. No journalist could quite explain how it worked, only that it worked exceedingly well. In London, a bespectacled reporter named Dan McCrum began to wonder whether the Emperor's Code contained bugs. He had tried to replicate Wirecard's growth claims by talking to merchants across Singapore, Manila, and Dubai. Most had never heard of the company. Those who had recalled a middleman, seldom Wirecard itself. McCrum's first article in the Financial Times landed with a thud in January 2015. Wirecard brushed it off as fake news, a phrase then new to European boardrooms. The stock dipped for a week, then rebounded, soaring higher than before. Short sellers who had bet against the firm felt the squeeze like cold iron around their chests. Wirecard's inner circle reacted with counter-accusations. Private investigators appeared outside journalists' apartments, snapping surreptitious photos. Twitter bots flooded timelines with messages proclaiming Braun a visionary. When authorities received anonymous tips suggesting balance sheet irregularities, Wirecard's lawyers claimed market manipulation by hedge funds. Regulators seemed to listen. The German financial watchdog, BaFin, did something unprecedented. It banned short selling of Wirecard shares for 2 months, shielding the company from skeptics rather than scrutinizing it. Back in Askim, the drizzle turned to summer heat. Inside the finance department, a soft-spoken accountant named Anna K. noticed that certain bank statements arrived as PDF scans rather than straight from the institutions. A transfer of 100 million euros supposedly held in a Singapore escrow account bore an unfamiliar font. She asked the supervisor whether the originals could be viewed. The answer came wrapped in a smile. Compliance has them, no need to duplicate effort. The smile suggested the matter was closed. Wirecard's claims grew bolder. By 2018, it had shoved Commerzbank aside to join the blue-chip DAX index, Germany's corporate pantheon. Television anchors considered it proof that Europe could, in fact, birth a tech giant to rival California. Venture capitalists tweeted selfies in the Askium lobby, where a brushed steel sculpture of an infinite loop symbolized continuous innovation. Only the loop, in hindsight, looked more like a snake feeding on its tail. That autumn, Macrum published leaked internal documents detailing overnight transfers worth hundreds of millions. Money that hopped from bank to bank before returning to its starting point, leaving behind a paper trace of phantom revenue. Wirecard issued immediate denials. Its chairman, a patrician former Deutsche Bank executive named Wolf Matthias, described the leaks as fabricated nonsense. Still, auditors at EY felt the ground tremble. Each annual review became a negotiation over sampling methods and cutoff dates. EY partners, perhaps lulled by years of spotless German engineering, eventually signed off again, attaching a glowing opinion. The domino that finally wobbled stood far from Munich, an unassuming office above a Filipino fast food restaurant in Makati. This was the registered address of Citadel Corporate, one of Wirecard's key trustees, allegedly safeguarding 1.9 billion euros in escrow. When two German investigators visited in late 2019, they found a shuttered door, dusty furniture, and a receptionist from another firm who shrugged. There was no vault, no server room, no armored couriers. Only the smell of frying garlic drifting up from the street. January 2020 arrived with a tension that felt like air before lightning. Wirecard postponed the release of its annual report, citing pandemic-related delays. Braun delivered a video message promising a spectacularly positive audit outcome. In reality, EY could not confirm the existence of the 1.9 billion euros. Bank of the Philippine Islands and BDO Unibank, whose letters supposedly verified the cash, declared the documents forgeries. The money, it appeared, was as virtual as a video game coin. On June 18, 2020, Wirecard admitted what skeptics had long suspected: the cash was likely never there. The share price collapsed 99% in 2 days. Employees learned of the implosion by watching televised news in the company cafeteria. Some cried into paper coffee cups, others stared blankly at locked computer screens. Braun resigned that evening, still clad in a black turtleneck, before being arrested on suspicion of inflating revenue to secure loans worth billions. Meanwhile, the company's flamboyant chief operating officer, Jan Marsalek, vanished. He told colleagues he would sort things out in the Philippines, boarded a private jet to Minsk, and disappeared into a fog of speculation: Russian safe houses, Libyan militias, Secret Service ties. Interpol issued a red notice, but Marsalek remained a ghost, the ultimate embodiment of Wirecard's missing billions, present in theory, absent in reality. By August, Wirecard had filed for insolvency, becoming the first DAX member to do so. Thousands of small investors lost life savings. Pension funds absorbed dents that would take years to mend. In a Bundestag inquiry, lawmakers grilled auditors, regulators, and bankers. Why had no one asked for a simple bank balance confirmation earlier? Answers came wrapped in caveats, but the subtext was clear. Germany believed its own fairy tale about technological rebirth, and belief can be a powerful sedative. Today, the Askium campus sits half-occupied, signage removed, its glass still catching Bavarian sunlight. At certain angles, the building looks untouched, yet inside, cardboard boxes line corridors where engineers once planned digital wallets. The infinite loop sculpture remains in the lobby, now blocked off by plastic tape. Visitors notice a fine dust on its surface, as though the air itself has settled after a long, frantic storm. The scandal rewired European oversight. Yet, as with every great fraud, regulations chase footprints already fading. The true lesson lingers in quieter places. An accountant's raised eyebrow, a journalist's stubborn question, a receptionist's puzzled shrug above a Filipino fast food shop. Each small signal warned that the money was missing. But it is hard to hear whispers over the roar of a perfect growth story, until the silence afterward is deafening. Silicon dreams in a tiny drop. The lab sat behind smoked glass on Page Mill Road, Palo Alto, its sign a single word in crimson: Theranos. From the street it looked like any other startup campus. Clean lines, smart landscaping, a hint of disruptive genius whispered into view. Inside, Elizabeth Holmes paced hallways in her trademark black turtleneck, blue eyes fixed on a vision she rehearsed until it felt inevitable. A world where a few drops of blood could unlock every medical secret. Investors listened, enthralled. She spoke softly, with the measured cadence of someone delivering tomorrow, and they leaned forward to meet it. Holmes had founded Theranos at 19, dropping out of Stanford after one fateful semester of chemical engineering lectures. She told mentors that needles terrified her. She wanted to revolutionize diagnostics so no one else would feel the sting. But revolution requires capital. She founded an old guard titans, Larry Ellison, Rupert Murdoch, the Walton-Ayers, men who saw in her a rare alchemy of purpose and profit. By 2014, the company's valuation touched $9 billion, and Holmes's personal stake crowned her the youngest self-made female billionaire on Earth. Yet inside the so-called Edison device, an oblong box engineered to sit on pharmacy counters, parts rattled like loose change in a drawer. Technicians in white coats worked past midnight, coaxing prototype after prototype to produce stable readings. Sometimes the Edison cooperated. More often it whined, jammed, or returned error codes in red text. When deadlines loomed, engineers bolted commercial Siemens analyzers inside the lab, diluting tiny blood samples with saline so traditional machines could handle them. Test results reached patients on Walgreens letterhead, yet few knew their blood had traveled down a hallway into off-the-shelf hardware rather than the miracle box advertised. Sonny Balwani, Holmes's right-hand lieutenant, tightened the screws. He patrolled corridors like a general, demanding loyalty beyond skepticism. Employees signed non-disclosure agreements thick as phone books. Emails carried warnings in bold type that unauthorized sharing would invite litigation. A culture of secrecy settled over headquarters, glossy as fresh lacquer. Visitors saw only what the script allowed. A product demo in a dim room where screens glowed green, the Edison humming beneath a black shroud. Everything else, error logs, lab-developed hacks, failed quality control data, hid behind digital firewalls. Still, rumors slipped through. Erica Chung, a recent Berkeley graduate, noticed wild result swings on proficiency tests sent to external labs. A single patient sample split into 2 vials could return potassium levels at opposite ends of the spectrum. She flagged the anomaly. A manager advised her to trust the algorithm. Chung instead compiled a dossier and quietly left. Tyler Schultz, grandson of former Secretary of State George Shultz, a board member, tried to raise similar alarms. Family dinners turned tense. Boardroom legends rarely believe grandchildren over charismatic founders. Wall Street, meanwhile, prepared its victory lap. Time magazine placed Holmes on its cover, Forbes hailed her as healthcare Steve Jobs, and conference stages across America glowed beneath her black sleeves. But John Carreyrou, an investigative reporter at the Wall Street Journal, smelled smoke. Tips from disillusioned employees reached his inbox describing broken assays, FDA dodges, and a CEO who seemed to will numbers into existence. Carreyrou spent months confirming each detail, phoning sources from his Brooklyn kitchen late at night so Theranos' legal team couldn't triangulate time zones. On October 15, 2015, Carreyrou's first article dropped like a guillotine. He wrote that Theranos used conventional machines for the vast majority of its tests and struggled to meet basic accuracy standards. Holmes called the story factually inaccurate on CNBC that very morning, her voice calm but steely, like a violin string tightened to its limit. She invited regulators to inspect the lab. Certain transparency would end doubts. What followed was the opposite. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS, arrived with clipboards and found microbial contamination, expired reagents, unqualified staff overseeing complex assays. One report concluded patients faced immediate jeopardy. Holmes promised swift fixes. CMS banned her from owning or operating a blood testing facility for 2 years. Walgreens shuttered its Theranos wellness centers, and the once unstoppable valuation deflated faster than a pricked balloon. Litigation sprouted everywhere. Investors sued for fraud, patients for misdiagnosis, partners for breach of contract. Yet perhaps the most chilling moment unfolded in a federal courtroom in San Jose years later. Prosecutors displayed internal emails where Balwani urged staff to accept no excuses, while quality control flags blinked red. Jurors watched clips of Holmes declaring on national television, "We can run every lab test from a tiny finger stick." Statements prosecutors labeled knowingly false. The defense spoke of belief, optimism, startup pivots, but belief does not convert saline into hemoglobin, nor does optimism keep potassium within safe range. In January 2022, a verdict arrived. Holmes guilty on 4 counts of fraud and conspiracy. Balwani would follow months later. Sentencing hearings felt subdued, almost clinical. No outraged crowds, only the quiet recitation of statutes and losses. Patients testified about panic attacks triggered by incorrect HIV results. Investors described trusting eyes now dimmed. Holmes, once the icon of fearless disruption, stood small behind a wooden podium, apologizing for mistakes. The black turtleneck remained, but the aura of inevitability had long since slipped away. Today the Theranos building lies repurposed, its logo pried off in clean metallic letters that now gather dust in an evidence locker. A new startup occupies the space, walls freshly painted, yet some engineers swear the elevators hum differently near the third floor where the Edison prototypes once stacked. Perhaps it is only imagination, ghosts of ambition reverberating in steel, but the lesson lingers like a faint stain. Science is not theater, and sleek presentations cannot transmute wishful thinking into reliable data. Outside, Silicon Valley still buzzes with venture capital and caffeinated engineers chasing tomorrow. But every so often a pitch meeting pauses, someone asks to see raw validation data, and an uncomfortable silence falls. In that moment, Theranos Echo performs its final necessary service, reminding dreamers that disruptive visions become nightmares the instant truth is diluted, even by a single tiny drop. The velvet silence of Suite 1700. Even on winter evenings, the reception area of Lipstick Building in Midtown Manhattan glimmered with soft, flattering light. Visitors stepped off the elevator on the 17th floor and entered a hush so velvety it seemed to absorb every footfall. A single brass plaque read Bernard L. Madoff Investment Securities LLC. No marketing posters, no league tables, no Bloomberg terminals flashing hectic numbers, just tasteful cream walls and a receptionist who knew each appointment by name. To clients, that quiet signaled exclusivity. To outsiders, it revealed almost nothing at all. Bernard Bernie Madoff cultivated invisibility the way some billionaires cultivate yachts. He wore earth-tone suits that looked borrowed from a careful accountant, kept his gray hair short, his smile brief, his quotations modest, steady returns, no heroics. Yet across Palm Beach, the Hamptons, and Europe's private bank salons, stories circulated of a former NASDAQ chairman who could conjure annual gains of 10 to 12% regardless of market storms. The numbers felt magical, but Madoff never described them as such. He preferred the term split-strike conversion strategy, a phrase so drowsy even seasoned bankers nodded as though they understood. Investors called themselves fortunate for getting in. Madoff never advertised. He accepted accounts only through word of mouth, making each allocation sound like a favor. Feeder fund managers, men with lacquered desks in Geneva and Madrid, plied him with fine wine and new capital. They, in turn, charged their own clients rich fees, explaining that access required trust, a commodity scarcer than gold. 4 years those clients opened monthly statements showing smooth upward lines while the S&P bucked like a rodeo horse. Gratitude replaced curiosity, questions felt almost impolite. Yet, inside Suite 1700, trades were ghost. 2 junior staff printed the same spreadsheet again and again, changing only the date in the header. A single dot matrix printer, its ribbon thinning, spat out trade confirmations purportedly from blue-chip brokers. The papers stacked in fireproof cabinets, corroborating a market activity that never took place. Actual investing happened 1 floor below, where Bernie's brother Peter oversaw a legitimate market-making desk, a noise machine whose real transactions camouflaged the silence upstairs. The fraud's engine was brutally simple: new money paid old promises. When Mrs. Goldberg in Boca Raton requested her quarterly withdrawal, funds from a recent European subscription wired in to cover the redemption. The scheme required velocity, not sophistication, and for decades velocity obliged. Even the occasional SEC examiner found little. Madoff met them politely, produced binders of records, explained his strategy in soft professorial tones. The examiners, often junior and overworked, left impressed by a Wall Street elder statesman who appeared eager to cooperate. But in Boston, a derivatives expert named Harry Markopoulos sensed an impossible equation. In 1999 he received a tip sheet describing Madoff's split-strike returns and sat down with a pad of paper. The options required to hedge that volume, he calculated, exceeded all options traded on the Chicago Board Options Exchange. $text volume \text Madoff \text volume \text CBOE market, comma, his pencil scrawled, an absurd inequality. Markopoulos compiled an 18-page memo titled, "The World's Largest Hedge Fund is a Fraud," and mailed it to the SEC years past. He sent updated versions. Each landed like a whisper in a hurricane. The weather changed in autumn 2008. Lehman Brothers collapsed, hedge funds gated redemptions, and suddenly many of Madoff's clients needed cash, not paper profits. Withdrawal requests surged beyond the inflow of fresh money. For the first time, the carefully balanced teeter-totter tilted the wrong way. On December 10th, Bernie called his sons, Mark and Andrew, to his penthouse on East 64th Street. The apartment overlooked modest strings of holiday lights twinkling along Fifth Avenue. Over coffee he confessed, almost conversationally, "It's all one big lie. A giant Ponzi scheme." He estimated the whole at 50 billion. The next evening the sons, lawyers by their side, delivered their father to federal agents. Bernie wore a charcoal overcoat, nasal voice steady as he answered booking questions. Outside the Daniel Patrick Moynihan courthouse, snowflakes fell past streetlights, swirling like torn account statements. Newsrooms fired alerts worldwide. Retirees in Florida turned up television volumes. Feeder fund executives stared into bar mirrors, calculating clawbacks before the ice melted. Investigators descended on Suite 1700. Cabinets yielded towers of manila folders, each a ledger of fiction. Bank records at JP Chase showed billions flowing in and scarcely any securities flowing out. The printer still droned, unaware the performance had ended. Agents photographed every desk, every shredder, every post-it. In one drawer they found a list titled VIP, containing senators, movie producers, Nobel laureates, names that had lent social proof to the illusion. Courtroom proceedings moved with eerie speed. On March 12, 2009, Madoff stood before Judge Denny Chin and pled guilty to 11 counts, from securities fraud to money laundering. He offered no deal, no elaborate defense, only quiet acknowledgement. Victims packed the gallery, some clutching photocopies of now worthless statements. One spoke of college savings erased, another of charities forced to close food pantries. Judge Chin, noting extraordinary evil, sentenced Madoff to 150 years, the statutory equivalent of forever. Yet justice rarely balances books. Funds recovered through asset sales and clawback suits eventually reached about 40 billion, remarkable but far from the paper loss. Trust, once squandered, pays no interest. Feeder fund managers fought lawsuits, claiming ignorance. Regulators testified about staffing shortages. Markopoulos, the ignored whistleblower, addressed Congress with the cadence of a man who has waited too long to be believed. Suite 1700 has since been leased to a marketing agency. Fresh paint masks the subtle odor of burnt toner, but late cleaners swear the silence feels thicker there, as if sound itself remembers. The brass plaque is gone, auctioned with office furniture to help repay victims. Somewhere, perhaps in a Florida retirement community, a widow still opens her mailbox half expecting one more perfect monthly statement, forgetting, for a wistful instant, that the numbers were only ever ink on snow. What endures is a caution spoken in wealth management conferences from Zurich to Minneapolis. Steady returns in a turbulent world demand more scrutiny, not less. All it takes to launch a Ponzi is confidence. All it takes to sustain it is polite reluctance to ask the next question. And when the questions finally come, they arrive like winter wind through revolving doors, swift, undeniable, and unforgiving. Shadows over Singapore Exchange. The trading room on the 32nd floor of Tower 1 Raffles Place never quite slept. Long after midnight, fluorescent strips still glowed above angled desks, illuminating towers of fax paper and empty styrofoam cups. Outside, Singapore's harbor lights winked across black water. Inside, a young Englishman named Nick Leeson orchestrated trades that seemed to spin the sun itself. His badge identified him as general manager of Barings Futures Singapore. Front office and back office merged in one sharp suit, an arrangement that felt efficient until it became fatal. Barings Bank was older than most countries, founded in 1762, woven into the fabric of British finance like a thread of guilt. Its partners strolled London in Seville Row coats, confident that solidity radiated from their mere presence. Leeson, by contrast, came from Watford, the electrician's son who leapfrogged class boundaries through sheer velocity. He passed London clearing exams, learned the rhythms of arbitrage, buy low in Osaka, sell high in Singapore, then volunteered to set up Barings outpost beneath the neon kanji of the Nikkei trading floor. The operation's heart was a partitioned square no larger than a modest kitchen. Traders with colored jackets, clerks punching tickets, and Leeson floating between them, half choreographer, half deity. He sold the bank on a tidy formula: exploit tiny price gaps between Japanese stock index futures listed in Osaka and Singapore, scooping pennies each time the markets blinked. Volume was key. The more contracts he moved, the fatter the cushion grew. When the head office saw month-end statements, always profits, never variances, it nodded approval. Annual bonuses flowed, deferential memos called Leeson a star. But a sliver of digital real estate inside Barings' accounting system carried a different label: Error Account 88888. Originally intended to park mismatched trades for a few hours, it became Leeson's private attic of contradictions. A botched ticket here, an out-of-the-money option there, mistakes common to frenetic trading. He stashed them all in 88888 to avoid London's ire. He told himself the losses were temporary, that tomorrow's winning positions would plug today's holes. The attic, however, had no ceiling. Japanese markets turned skittish in early 1994. The Nikkei slid, rebounds petered out, volatility cracked like summer thunder. Leeson responded not by shrinking risk but by doubling it. He began taking directional positions, betting the index would rise. Each time it dipped instead, he bought more, convinced a reversal lurked one sunrise away. The once modest error account ballooned to hundreds of millions of pounds. Head office reports still looked pristine because profits from legitimate arbitrage masked mounting deficits down the hall. In effect, he was paying the bank with its own misplaced faith. Colleagues noticed curious tensions. A settlements clerk recalled Leeson snapping at minor queries. Another saw him sweating through his collar at 10 a.m. Yet, every evening he faxed London updates of healthy gains. The numbers bore the signature of Barings' external auditor, Coopers and Lybrand, except the signature was a photocopied cutout taped onto forms before faxing. No one compared originals. Trust, like old wallpaper, covered cracks. January 1995 dawned with a hush over Tokyo. Rumors of a U.S. interest rate hike rippled. Leeson held positions equivalent to two-thirds of the entire open interest on the Nikkei 225 futures contract, an absurd share for a mid-sized bank but invisible inside Barings' gilded halls. On January 17, the Great Hanshin earthquake struck Kobe. Buildings crumbled, highways folded, and the Nikkei nosedived. Within hours, error account 88888 showed a loss near £200 million. Leeson phoned London. A few temporary issues, nothing serious. He sought one last roll of the dice, short-dated options called bull spreads. If the index bounced, the spreads would yield a miraculous resurrection. But Kobe's aftershocks extended to sentiment. Traders saw only rubble. The Nikkei sagged. Each tick lower widened Leeson's wound. By mid-February, losses breached £400 million, more than Barings' total capital. On February 23, Leeson left a brief note on his desk. "I'm sorry." He boarded a flight to Kuala Lumpur with his wife, Lisa, and vanished into a blur of airports and cheap hotels. In London, Barings executives opened faxes, called Singapore, and finally logged into the settlement system. Figures once shunted aside now screamed in unison. They saw 88888 for the first time not as an error bucket but as a black hole. Over the weekend, a frantic search for a white knight investor failed. At 6 a.m. on Monday, February 27, 1995, Barings Bank declared insolvency. Employees learned their fate from BBC Radio. Some wept in taxis, others stared at marble floors suddenly stripped of certainty. The Bank of England arranged a sale to ING for the ceremonial price of £1, the oldest merchant bank in Britain reduced to a single coin. Leeson was arrested in Frankfurt weeks later, reading airport departure boards with resigned eyes. Extradited to Singapore, he faced a courtroom painted in stern teak, pled guilty to fraud, and received 6.5 years in Changi prison. The tropical heat pressed against concrete walls. Cancer would shave weight from his frame before early release. Regulators dissected the carcass. They found a perfect storm of weak oversight. A trader controlling both the money and the measurement of money, managers dazzled by steady profits, auditors lulled by tidy paperwork. Today, textbooks cite three numbers, 8-8-8-8-8, as shorthand for segregation of duties gone missing. The Singapore trading floor still thrums, but older dealers sometimes glance at an empty corner and lower their voices. New interns are told the story of a single terminal where risk metastasized unobserved, not as a scare tactic but as inherited folklore. In London, Barings' former headquarters on Bishopsgate hosts a co-working hub. Young entrepreneurs sip lattes beneath ornate ceilings, unaware of a morning when guilt turned to dust. The lesson hovers like equatorial humidity: visibility is oxygen. Deprive an institution of clear sight and deception will bloom, whether by malice or desperate hope. All it takes is one unchecked account, one charismatic employee, one moment when the earthquake outside meets the fault line within. Then, empires measured in centuries can crumble before dawn, leaving only shadows on the exchange floor and the echo of a quiet apology, "I'm sorry." Milk, marble, and the missing billions. The morning milk trucks rolled out of the Parmalat plant in Collecchio at dawn, their silver tanks reflecting faint rose light over Parma's flat fields. Inside headquarters, Enrico Tanzi paced a corridor lined with marble busts of Italian composers, murmuring reassurances into a cordless phone. He thanked lenders for their confidence, promised figures by Friday, and ended each call with a gentle grazie. To visitors, Tanzi radiated small-town warmth elevated by global ambition. A devout Catholic who kept family portraits on every shelf yet presided over a dairy empire stretching from Latin America to Australia. Parmalat's rise felt almost operatic. Tanzi had inherited a single pasteurization machine behind his father's grocery store in 1961. 40 years later, the brand's blue and orange cartons filled supermarket aisles from Milan to Montreal. The company sponsored Formula One teams, bought television stations, even snapped up a bankrupt soccer club called Parma AC. Shareholders applauded each bold step. Analysts praised Tanzi's visionary vertical integration. Behind the applause, however, spreadsheets groaned under sudden gravity-defying expansions. On paper, Parmalat thrived. Revenue climbed in smooth stair-steps. Net income followed like an obedient child. Yet cash seemed curiously shy. Tanzi's finance chief, Fausto Tana, explained that liquidity sat abroad, specifically at a Cayman Islands unit named Bonlat. Bonlat, he claimed, parked excess earnings in secure bonds, ready to supply head office when needed. Auditors at Grant Thornton Italia saw bank statements confirming 3.95 billion resting peacefully at Bank of America Cayman branch. The signatures appeared genuine, the stationery crisp. They initialed the pages and moved on. Meanwhile, debt piled up. Tanzi issued complex, credit-linked notes, promising investors double-digit yields. When journalists in Milan questioned why a milk company required Wall Street-grade leverage, Tana delivered a practiced shrug. Acquisitions demand agility. Few pressed harder. After all, Parmalat had never missed an interest payment. Lenders from Deutsche Bank to Citigroup kept the tap open, seduced by porcelain-smooth financial ratios. Not everyone drank the milk without sniffing. A hedge fund analyst in London noticed that Parmalat's reported cash exceeded the cumulative cash produced by operations, an accounting impossibility unless money replicated itself like bacteria in warmed cream. His report circulated quietly among short sellers, but Italian newspapers focused on sports sponsorships and Tanzi's philanthropic donations, including a gleaming children's hospital wing in Parma. Suspicion wilted under civic pride. Autumn 2003 introduced a chill. Ratings agencies demanded proof that Bonlat's billions were real, not just digits in the ether. Tana forwarded the familiar Bank of America statement. This time, auditors asked headquarters in Charlotte for direct confirmation. The reply landed with a thud. "We have no record of such an account." The elegant facade cracked. A December board meeting convened under fluorescent glare rather than chandelier light. Tanzi confessed to directors that the Cayman cash never existed, that balance sheets had been adjusted for years, and that the actual shortfall might be 8 billion euros, perhaps more. Shock settled over the room like powdered milk dust. Days later, Parmalat missed a routine 150 million euro bond payment, triggering alarms across Europe's credit markets. Italian Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi, confronting the largest corporate collapse in national history, dispatched emergency commissioners to Collecchio. Investigators traced funds through a labyrinth of shell companies with lyrical names: Kirkcastle, Zilpa, Coloniali, each layer masking another diversion. They discovered invoices for powdered milk that never shipped, television rights sold twice, and circular loans in which Parmalat borrowed from itself via Caribbean conduits. One letter uncovered in Tana's files read simply, "We must create profit of at least 500 million euros this quarter, please arrange." A subordinate had obligingly generated a journal entry. Parmalat's implosion flooded Italian television during the Christmas season. Pensioners who had invested in safe food bonds watched Carol specials interrupted by grim anchors quoting missing money tallies. Supermarket shoppers stared at familiar cartons, suddenly wondering whether contents might vanish like balance sheet cash. The government guaranteed dairy deliveries to avoid panicked buying of children's staples. Tanzi surrendered to police on December 27, stepping out of a black Mercedes beneath slate skies. Cameras captured his downturned gaze, the devotional medal still glinting at his neck. Questioned for hours, he spoke of excessive ambition, claimed the fraud began small, merely smoothing quarterly dips, then metastasized when banks demanded ever larger growth. "I was convinced we could trade our way out," he whispered, echoing many fallen captains before him. Court proceedings in Parma carried a distinctly local flavor. Prosecutors cited not only financial statutes but moral betrayal of community trust. Witnesses included farmers unpaid for raw milk and stadium vendors suddenly out of work after Parma AC's payroll evaporated. Tanzi was convicted of market rigging and sentenced to 18 years. Tana received a lesser term for cooperating. Appeals trimmed months but not the stigma. Grant Thornton Italia folded. Regulators fined banks for enabling opaque debt deals, though the penalties paled beside investor losses. A state-backed administrator rebuilt Parmalat around its core dairy assets, minus the glamour projects and Cayman mirages. In 2011, the French giant Lactalis acquired the humbled firm, keeping production in Parma but replacing the marble-lined executive wing with simpler offices. Employees returning from the factory floor say the corridors feel brighter now, though perhaps that is only fresh paint where guilt once gleamed. Yet certain reminders linger. An elevator still opens onto a small foyer where Tanzi's portrait used to hang. The wall remains intentionally bare, a mute fresco of caution. Finance students touring the plant hear guides repeat a proverb. Lattes aguasta presto, milk spoils quickly, then pause so visitors might reflect on balance sheets that sour even faster when left untested. The missing billions were, in the end, numbers poured from one vessel to another until nothing remained but froth. But the echo reaches farther. Across Europe, auditors now demand direct bank confirmations. Bond investors squint at foreign subsidiaries, and every carton of milk, however wholesome, carries the faint aftertaste of a lesson hard-earned in the marble halls of Collecchio. Echoes in the empty fiber. Night settled early over Clinton, Mississippi, yet the squat gray building marked WorldCom glimmered like a lantern on the prairie. Inside, floor-to-ceiling maps traced colored lines across continents, submarine cables, dark fiber, satellite loops, all converging under the proud slogan, "The World on Time." Executives like to say the company didn't merely carry phone calls, it carried the new global pulse. And at the center of that pulse stood Bernard Bernie Ebbers, a former motel manager who spoke in a syrupy drawl and wore cowboy boots to earnings calls. Ebbers's rise had been the stuff of Booster Club folklore. He stitched together dozens of small long-distance outfits during the 1990s telecom boom, paying for each with a mix of stock and charisma. Analysts dubbed him the telecom cowboy, without quite deciding whether it was praise or warning. Shareholders, hypnotized by revenue curves that rose as steeply as Mississippi humidity, bought in anyway. WorldCom's stock soared from pennies to triple digits, and Ebbers borrowed against his shares to finance ranches, timberland, even a minor league hockey team. Only on the 12th floor, behind a door labeled Corporate Accounting or Restricted, did the pulse skip. There, a soft-spoken controller named Betty Vinson keyed journal entries past midnight. At first they were small adjustments, moving a few million from one bucket to another so earnings met Wall Street's whisper number. Then came a directive from Scott Sullivan, the boy-genius chief financial officer whose suits cost more than Vincent's car. Book the line costs as capital expenditures. She blinked. Line costs, fees paid to other carriers, were monthly expenses, gone the moment a call ended. Capitalizing them turned fleeting charges into sturdy assets, instantly boosting profit. Vincent hesitated. Sullivan assured her it was a temporary bridge until revenues caught up with promises. "Just a quarter or two," he said, sliding a manila folder across her desk. Inside lay figures already formatted for the press release. She inserted them into the ledger, hit enter, and felt the spreadsheet accept the fiction without protest. The bridge became a highway. Each quarter demanded a larger adjustment. $771 million, $941 million, $1.4 billion. Sullivan's finance team coined a bland euphemism, prepaid capacity. Whenever auditors from Arthur Andersen asked why capital spending dwarfed industry norms, managers talked excitedly about future traffic, global build-outs, synergies from the MCI merger. Their voices radiated such certainty that skepticism seemed almost unpatriotic in the broadband age. Meanwhile, Ebbers paced conference stages, quoting scripture and margin percentages in the same breath. He promised 15% growth forever, a daring pledge in a market cooling faster than anyone admitted. Dot-coms collapsed, but WorldCom's earnings sailed on, quarter after perfect quarter. Cable news anchors celebrated the anomaly, rivals muttered it was witchcraft. The few analysts who issued hold ratings found client calls unreturned. On a Friday in March 2002, Cynthia Cooper, head of internal audit, received an anonymous tip. Look at the capital account, nothing there should be capitalized. Cooper gathered 2 trusted colleagues after hours, pulled invoices from a locked cabinet, and began matching them to ledger entries. Many invoices lacked supporting contracts. Others showed routine maintenance coded as multi-year assets. The numbers didn't reconcile. At 2 a.m. the trio stared at a whiteboard scrawled with circles and arrows representing $3 billion that existed only on paper. They approached Sullivan for clarification. He responded with a smile thin as dial tone static. Focus on Sarbanes-Oxley when it passes, not on past quarters. That night Cooper dialed WorldCom's outside directors from her living room, her voice shaky yet firm. The board hired KPMG to perform a rapid review. KPMG's team, armed with laptops and flashlights, descended into the accounting department like spelunkers, unearthing a cavern of classification games totaling $11 billion. On June 25, 2002, WorldCom issued a press release after markets closed. It would restate earnings downward by $3.8 billion due to inappropriate accounting. By dawn the figure had already grown. Trading halted. When shares reopened they plummeted from $15 to pennies. Employees checked retirement accounts only to find evaporated futures staring back like blank screens. In Clinton, cafeteria chatter stopped mid-sentence. In New York, a giant WorldCom banner outside the Nasdaq Tower was hurriedly removed before lunchtime. Ebers resigned within weeks, still insisting he knew nothing about the numbers. In truth, margin calls on his personal loans had already forced him to plead for board-approved bailouts, which regulators now cited as motive. Sullivan was arrested in his driveway, neighbors watching as agents and windbreakers led him away. Betty Vinson surrendered quietly. Her statement to prosecutors read like a diary of incremental surrender. I was afraid to say no. WorldCom filed for Chapter 11 on July 21, 2002, the largest bankruptcy in U.S. history until Enron's record only months earlier. Court proceedings painted a simple equation. Reported EBITDA equals actual EBITDA plus capitalized expenses. Reported EBITDA equals actual EBITDA plus capitalized expenses. A tweak to bookkeeping had masqueraded as business genius. Ebers received 25 years. Sullivan, after testifying, got 5. Vinson served a reduced term, emerging to speak at universities about the perils of quiet compliance. The company re-emerged in 2004 as MCI, then sold to Verizon. Its logo retired like a jersey from a disgraced athlete. The Clinton headquarters stands half-leased. Fiber maps still adorn a lobby wall, colors fading where sun hits the glass. Janitors claim that after midnight the overhead lights sometimes flicker, as if circuits remember the surge of data never sent. Today, every telecom earnings call includes obligatory slides on capitalization policies. Auditors demand granular proof before greenlighting numbers. Yet the true lesson whispers between the lines of any spreadsheet. When growth is promised louder than it is earned, someone will try to book tomorrow into today. All it takes is a keystroke and a door marked restricted, but the echoes last far longer than the call. The soot beneath Wolfsburg's snow. A gentle powder blanketed Wolfsburg the morning Martin Winterkorn stepped from his chauffeured sedan and crossed the glass bridge into Volkswagen's Vorstand wing. Snow-muffled factory clangs, turning Europe's largest automaker into a model village, its chimneys exhaling steam as white as alpine air. Winterkorn paused to admire the scene. If the city looked clean, the brand felt invincible. From Shanghai to Sao Paulo, diesel Golfs and Passats promised blue motion efficiency, German engineering that sipped fuel and spared the planet. Inside, however, a phrase echoed through certain engineering cubicles: the acoustic function. It sounded benign, a software routine that smoothed engine rumble, yet it concealed a darker switch. When the car's computer sensed laboratory conditions, steering wheel fixed, wheels spinning, air temperature steady, it toggled exhaust controls, scrubbing nitrogen oxide fumes to near zero. On real roads the software politely bowed out, restoring performance and mileage at the cost of pollutants 40 times the legal limit. The cheat began small at Volkswagen's sprawling research center in Ingolstadt in 2005. Engineers were racing to meet tough US emission targets without sacrificing the zippy torque Europeans adored. Early prototypes failed routine tests. Each adjustment tipped a delicate balance between power, economy, and compliance. Then one coder suggested an elegant workaround: detect the test cycle, behave impeccably, and the rest of the time, drive naturally. Managers nodded, deadlines loomed, and the patch merged quietly into production code. Years passed. Clean diesel became a marketing crusade. Super Bowl commercials showed VW owners kicking crude oil barrels down suburban driveways while children giggled in the back seat. Sales climbed, regulators applauded. Winter Korn, who carried micrometers in his breast pocket to demonstrate obsession with tolerances, presented record profits to shareholders, bowing stiffly amid thunderous applause. In West Virginia, far from Wolfsburg's snow, a small research team at the International Council on Clean Transportation decided to conduct real-world emissions tests. They borrowed a Passat and a Jetta, rigged tailpipes with sensors, and drove from San Diego to Seattle. Data points flickered on laptops. Highway readings soared far above lab results. Maybe a calibration error, one student said. They reran the route, the figures worsened. Puzzled, they published a modest paper in May 2014, assuming the findings would prompt a quick technical recall. The report landed on the desk of Alberto Ayala at the California Air Resources Board, CRB. He requested a meeting with Volkswagen America. Company engineers arrived in crisp polos, attributing the anomaly to unexpected conditions and promising a software update. CARB scheduled follow-up tests. The update shifted numbers but not enough. Weeks turned into months. VW provided PowerPoint decks dense with graphs, yet withheld raw code, citing intellectual property. Suspicion coiled tighter. By September 2015, CARB partnered with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and issued an ultimatum. Explain the gap or face certification delays for the next model year. In Wolfsburg's executive suite, crisis teams gathered beneath fluorescent panels. The cheat, once a clever shortcut, now threatened billions in North American revenue. Winter Korn asked for options. Engineers whispered that no patch could fix chemistry. The hardware physically lacked the capacity to clean exhaust under real-world loads. Someone suggested full disclosure. Silence met the idea, heavy as falling snow. On September 18, 2015, the EPA made disclosure for them. A press release accused Volkswagen of installing defeat devices in nearly 500,000 U.S. vehicles. Within hours, European outlets echoed the charge, adding millions more cars to the tally. VW's stock plunged 20%, wiping €15 billion in value, the largest one-day drop in company history. Employees watched ticker screens darken like power outages rippling across a grid. Winter Korn released a video statement, jaw rigid, voicing profound apologies, while insisting he had been unaware of wrongdoing. 5 days later he resigned, the micrometer in his pocket suddenly symbolic, not of precision but of missed oversight. Investigators raided company sites, seizing servers and notebooks. Engineers once lauded for ingenuity now studied legal subpoenas with trembling hands. Court documents later revealed internal emails. We won't make the U.S. clean diesel targets legally. The acoustic function can be calibrated to recognize test cycles. Sentences devoid of drama yet heavy with intent. Prosecutors used them to build criminal cases. One middle manager, Oliver Schmidt, was arrested during a Florida vacation. Another engineer, James Leong, pleaded guilty and testified about meetings where the software stratagem was openly discussed. Volkswagen eventually admitted the device lurked in 11 million vehicles worldwide. It allocated €6.7 billion for recalls, a figure that ballooned to more than €30 billion in settlements, fines, and buybacks. The money repaired cars, funded electric vehicle research, and compensated governments, but it could not scrub trust from the tailpipes. Wolfsburg today still produces cars, the factory humming beneath chimneys now fitted with extra scrubbers more symbolic than necessary. A new CO displays battery prototypes instead of diesel injectors. Slogans tout way to zero, as though words might transplant institutional DNA. Yet in certain conference rooms, when slide decks promise breakthrough range or autonomous miracles, someone invariably clears their throat and asks, "How do we know?" The question hangs in the air, sharper than exhaust, demanding answers supported by code, chemistry, and candor. Outside, winter returns each year, laying fresh snow over the Midland Canal. Footprints of past errors hide beneath the surface, invisible to casual view but still there, compacted into memory. Employees heading home across the glass bridge glance down at their reflections, wondering how so many bright people let a switch label, acoustic function, become a synonym for fraud. The moral settles softly, like soot on snow. What seems harmless in the dark can stain the landscape once daylight arrives. The lone terminal at La Défense. The January sky over Paris hung low and pewter, mirroring the brushed steel of Société Générale's twin towers in La Défense. From the plaza below, office lights resembled constellations caught inside glass, yet one glowed long after others dimmed. A single workstation on the 5th floor of the Delta trading room. Its occupant, a lean Breton named Jérôme Kerviel, sat hunched over dual screens, fingers skating across shortcuts he knew by muscle memory. Security guards making rounds assumed he was reconciling trades. In truth, he was constructing a position big enough to tilt the European markets. Kerviel's badge identified him as a Delta 1 arbitrager, supposedly a low-risk role hedging small differences between equity futures and underlying shares. His supervisors praised him as sérieux, the quiet type who skipped long lunches and kept spreadsheets immaculate. Colleagues joked he scarcely left the building, yet no one wondered what incentive tethered a junior salaried employee to midnight spreadsheets. The incentive was hidden exposure. Long DAX futures here, short Euro stocks there, offsetting legs that canceled each other on official reports while, behind the scenes, fake hedges sat in the bank's back office queue, waiting to be deleted before dawn. The trick relied on timing. Each evening, Kerviel entered fictitious counter trades into the settlement system, giving risk controllers a balanced snapshot. Before morning broke, he canceled the hedges, leaving naked bets worth billions. Because the deletion occurred inside the same authorization level that created the trade, no secondary approval flagged the switch. Internal control believed positions totaled a few million euros. In reality, by the first week of 2008, exposure hovered near 50 billion euros, more than the bank's entire market capitalization. Kerviel told himself the risk was temporary, a strategy to front-run predictable index rebalancing and year-end flows. And often it worked. His 2007 book closed with 1.5 billion euros in profit, a figure he disguised as client flow by sprinkling gains across small house accounts. Management applauded, bonuses hinted. The praise felt intoxicating, erasing earlier memories of being a provincial kid who entered finance through back-office drudgery. Now he steered entire indices from a plastic keyboard, a puppeteer hidden in plain sight. Then came January 18, 2008. Rumors of a U.S. recession spooked global markets. The DAX fell 2% at the open, then 4%. Kerviel's unhedged longs bled crimson. He typed fresh fictitious shorts to mask the hole, but the market kept sinking. A whisper reached risk control. One of Kerviel's counterparties couldn't confirm a listed futures trade. Controllers queried the system. Discrepancies multiplied. That afternoon, Kerviel's supervisor summoned him to a glass-walled conference room. He entered carrying a folder he never opened. Auditors asked why confirmations were missing. He murmured "un erreur de saisie," a clerical error. They pressed. He exhaled and said, "There are positions you don't see." The next 48 hours felt like triage. Executives gathered under fluorescent ceiling panels, scrolling through exposures greater than the GDP of Slovakia. Discussions flipped between disbelief and pragmatism. How fast can we unwind? If they dumped everything at once, the markets would crater. Delay risked further losses. They chose speed. Traders sold in blocks across Asian, European, and US sessions, disguising volume through broker networks. The unwind finished by Tuesday night. Cost, 4.9 billion euros. On January 24th, Société Générale went public. A 20-page press release spoke of exceptional fraudulent transactions and a single rogue operator. Newspapers splashed the figure across front pages. TV anchors mapped it against Olympic stadiums filled with 50-euro notes. In Breton villages, Kerviel's surname became shorthand for reckless ambition. France sought a culprit and a motive. Prosecutors painted Kerviel as a shadow gambler chasing bonuses. Defense lawyers depicted him as a cog in a culture that prized profit over prudence. A child of the bank, who mimicked tolerated tricks until scale exposed hypocrisy. Emails surfaced. As long as it's winning, nobody asks questions. One manager admitted exploiting gray zones around booking dates. Regulators, stung, tightened daily position limits, but committees whispered the obvious. Oversight collapsed because gains lulled everyone into sleep. The trial in 2010 unfolded like theater in the Palais de Justice. Kerviel, trim in a navy suit, spoke softly, often addressing the judge as "Madam." He accepted responsibility yet insisted the bank knew volumes exceeded policy. Prosecutors introduced a simple arithmetic exhibit. Official net position, equals, declared long, minus, fake short, is almost equal to 0. Actual net position, equals, declared long, minus, 0 is almost equal to euro 50 billion. Official net position equals declared long minus fake short is almost equal to 0. Actual net position equals declared long minus 0 is almost equal to euro 50 billion. Jurors gasped. Even seasoned court reporters scribbled harder. The verdict: guilty of breach of trust and forgery, sentenced to 5 years, 2 suspended, and 4.9 billion euros in restitution, a sum symbolic, unpayable in 10 lifetimes. Kerviel served 110 days before early release, emerging to a media scrum on a rain-slick sidewalk. He spoke of writing a memoir, of perhaps consulting on ethics. Société Générale absorbed the loss, raised capital, and moved on, but glass partitions in the trading room now sport red warning lights whenever a position veers beyond preset limits. Veterans still glance at those LEDs as though they were smoke alarms. Out on the La Défense Esplanade, office workers hurry past the Twin Towers, unaware that one winter week a junior trader briefly controlled an empire's fortune. Cleaning crews swear the 5th floor monitor sometimes flickers at odd hours, no username logged in, just an empty trading grid reflecting ceiling lights, ghost code remembering the precise keystrokes that turn diligence into downfall. The lesson lingers in whispered slogans during compliance briefings. Complexity is camouflage, proximity is power. When creator and controller share the same password, even a fortress of steel and glass can be breached from within, not with explosives, but with silence and a fast hand on the delete key. The fake tech titan, Elizabeth Holmes and the Theranos deception. In the sun-drenched valleys of Silicon Valley, where bold dreams and billion-dollar startups bloom overnight, few stories captured the imagination like that of Elizabeth Holmes. At just 19 years old, Holmes dropped out of Stanford University, abandoning a promising academic career for a vision: to revolutionize healthcare with technology so groundbreaking it would change the world. She promised a future where blood testing, a routine medical procedure often dreaded for its pain and wait times, could be transformed into a fast, cheap, and virtually painless experience using just a few drops of blood from a simple finger prick. Her company, Theranos, was founded in 2003. From the outset, Holmes was a master of storytelling and image crafting. She adopted a signature look of black turtlenecks reminiscent of Steve Jobs, projecting an aura of visionary leadership that captivated investors and the media alike. Holmes's voice was husky and measured, commanding attention and conveying a sense of quiet certainty. Backed by a powerful board of advisors including former Secretaries of State Henry Kissinger and George Shultz, retired generals and Silicon Valley heavyweights, Theranos quickly rose to prominence. By 2014, the company was valued at nearly $10 billion, making Holmes one of the youngest self-made female billionaires. High-profile partners like Walgreens and Safeway signed agreements to offer Theranos blood tests in their stores, while investors poured hundreds of millions of dollars into the startup. The promise was seductive. No more needles, no more long waits for test results, and the ability to screen for hundreds of diseases and conditions from a single drop of blood. Hospitals and doctors hailed the potential breakthrough. Patients were eager to embrace the future of diagnostics. The media dubbed Holmes a visionary, a disruptor on the scale of Jobs or Gates. But behind the scenes, the story was far darker. Theranos' proprietary devices, the Edison machines, failed repeatedly in the lab. Engineers struggled with malfunctioning hardware and unreliable test results that often contradicted conventional blood testing methods. Despite this, Holmes and her executive team continued to claim that the technology was ready for market, concealing its shortcomings from investors, partners, regulators, and the public. When external labs began demanding samples for confirmatory testing, Theranos resorted to a deceptive tactic, sending most samples to traditional, FDA-approved machines while insisting the results were generated by their own devices. This ruse went undetected for years. Inside Theranos, a culture of fear and secrecy prevailed. Employees who raised concerns about the technology's failings faced intimidation, demotions, or outright dismissal. Whistleblowers would later come forward to reveal how they were pressured to manipulate data and silence internal dissent. Confidentiality agreements and legal threats kept many silent, while Holmes projected confidence and optimism at every public appearance. The illusion unraveled beginning in 2015 when John Carreyrou, a reporter for the Wall Street Journal, began investigating the company. Through interviews with former employees and confidential documents, Carreyrou exposed the fraud. Theranos' technology was inaccurate, unreliable, and in some cases, potentially dangerous. His series of investigative articles ignited regulatory scrutiny. Federal agencies, including the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services (CMS), conducted inspections and audits. Regulators found widespread issues: inaccurate tests, flawed lab practices, and failures to meet safety standards. Walgreens ended its partnership. The U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission (SEC) filed civil charges alleging a multi-million-dollar fraud against Holmes and Theranos. In 2018, Holmes and former President Sunny Balwani were indicted on multiple criminal counts, including wire fraud and conspiracy to defraud investors and patients. Prosecutors painted a picture of a company built on lies, where Holmes knew the truth about the failing technology but deliberately misled everyone to keep the money flowing. The trial, which lasted months, offered a stark contrast between Holmes's public persona and the reality of Theranos' operations. Witnesses testified about manipulated test results, fearful employees, and a leadership style that brooked no challenge. Holmes's defense argued she genuinely believed in the technology and did not intend to defraud investors or patients. In January 2022, after weeks of deliberations, the jury found Holmes guilty on 4 counts of fraud and conspiracy. She was sentenced to over 11 years in federal prison. Balwani was convicted separately and sentenced to nearly 13 years. The fallout from Theranos' collapse was far-reaching. Thousands of patients who relied on its tests faced uncertainty, with some receiving incorrect diagnoses or delayed treatments. Investors lost hundreds of millions of dollars. The company's implosion became a cautionary tale about the perils of hype over substance, especially in industries where lives hang in the balance. More than a story of financial deception, Theranos exposed how Silicon Valley's culture of disruption and fake it till you make it can sometimes cross the line into outright fraud. It showed how charisma and ambition can blind intelligent people, how fear and secrecy can suffocate truth, and how the desire to be a visionary can lead to devastating consequences. Elizabeth Holmes's story is not just about a failed startup. It is about the fragile nature of trust in science, the seduction of promise, and the human cost when technology is rushed before it's ready. In the end, the miracle blood test was just that, a mirage that vanished under scrutiny, leaving behind shattered lives and hard lessons. The missing billions of Wirecard. For years, the Munich skyline took quiet pride in the silver letters atop a glass tower just off Einstein Ring. Wirecard, the plucky German upstart that had leapt from scrappy payments processor to glittering fintech champion, seemed to embody Europe's digital future. Analysts praised its visionary CEO Markus Braun, a soft-spoken Austrian with frameless glasses and a monkish fondness for black turtlenecks. Politicians welcomed him as proof that Silicon Valley no longer held a monopoly on innovation. By 2018, Wirecard was worth more than Deutsche Bank, and Braun declared the company would soon handle payments for every second internet user on the planet. Yet beneath the spotless foyer and the gentle hum of elevators, something was off. Employees whispered that senior managers treated simple questions. How exactly does the Manila office generate such margins? Why are audits always delayed? As personal insults, requests for basic data were rerouted through layers of lawyers. And the CFO, a meticulous Swiss accountant, resigned after only 8 months, citing personal reasons and declining all interviews. The first public tremor arrived one cool April morning in 2015, when a short article appeared on a small circulation blog run by an anonymous London analyst. It alleged that Wirecard's explosive profits in Asia came from round-tripped cash. Money shuffled from one subsidiary to another in circles fast enough to blur the trail. Wirecard dismissed the post as nonsense written by market manipulators. Its share price dipped, then rebounded to fresh highs. But curiosity is stubborn. At the Financial Times, reporter Dan McCrum filed the blog into a growing folder labeled Wirecard Anomalies. He pored over Malaysian and Philippine corporate registries, comparing addresses, owners, and bank guarantees. Some subsidiaries shared the same dingy mailbox in a Manila shopping mall. Others listed directors who, when called, insisted they had never heard of Wirecard. In early 2019, McCrum's team published an exposé describing forged contracts and fake customers. Wirecard thundered back with lawsuits and press releases accusing the newspaper of colluding with short sellers. German regulators unusually sided with the company. They banned investors from betting against Wirecard stock and launched a criminal probe into the journalists. The message was clear. Wirecard was the pride of German tech. Doubting it bordered on treason. Inside the company, Chief Operating Officer Jan Marsalek projected icy calm. Athletic and fluent in 5 languages, Marsalek cultivated an air of mystery. He boasted of off-the-record trips to Libya, of private meetings with Russian intelligence, of cryptocurrency projects that would redefine trust. To nervous junior managers he offered a mantra: just deliver the numbers. Those numbers, however, were growing harder to conjure. Each new acquisition demanded fresh cash. Each audit asked for thicker evidence that Asian partners really held the balances Wirecard claimed. The solution was as old as fraud itself. Invent the balances and find a bank willing, or naive, enough to confirm them. Enter 2 small Philippine banks, BPI and BDO. Wirecard said they safeguarded €1.9 billion in escrow accounts on behalf of its payment clients. Year after year, auditors from Ernst & Young accepted photocopied letters, stamped and signed, attesting to the money's existence. It was only when a skeptical contingent insisted on calling Manila directly that the illusion began to tear. On the 16th of June 2020, a quizzical clerk at BPI told EY's German audit partner that the letter he held was not authentic. A similar call to BDO produced a terse statement: "We have no relationship with Wirecard." 48 hours later, EY refused to sign the annual accounts. Marcus Braun stood before cameras in Munich, cheeks pale under studio lights, and acknowledged the possibility that €1.9 billion may not exist. The markets reacted like a dam had burst. Wirecard shares, once €190, collapsed to €15 in 2 days, then to pennies. Braun was arrested for balance sheet manipulation but released on €5 million bail. Marsalek said he was traveling on business, and vanished, last tracked boarding a private jet from Austria to Minsk under a false name. Interpol later placed him on its most wanted list. Curiously, Wirecard's employees kept reporting to work even as police cleared desks for evidence. Engineers who had built perfectly functional payment gateways wondered how the success they touched daily could coexist with a void of almost €2 billion. A young product manager described the mood as a ship still under power with the engine room flooded. Parliamentary hearings soon revealed why the fraud had endured so long. Germany's financial watchdog, BaFin, had assigned only a single junior officer to monitor Wirecard, a company handling billions in global transactions, because it was technically classified as a technology firm, not a financial institution. Ministers admitted they had celebrated Wirecard's rise so loudly that they became blind to its faults. The most chilling discovery arrived when investigators compared server logs with bank statements. Many of the Asian customers whose payments supposedly flowed through Wirecard's gateways were defunct gambling sites, their domains registered minutes before quarter end, their traffic little more than scripted bots clicking pay now in endless loops. The revenue these bots generated was booked as real, then padded by phony cash confirmations from partner trustees. Auditors, lulled by previous clean opinions, looked no deeper. By August 2020, Wirecard AG entered insolvency, Europe's first DAX-listed company to do so. Employees scattered, though some engineers were rehired by rival fintechs grateful for their skills. Marcus Braun sits in a Munich jail awaiting trial, still insisting that the missing billions were stolen by third parties. Jan Marsalek remains a specter in intelligence rumors, perhaps in Moscow under the protection of the GRU, perhaps nowhere at all. In the end, the story of Wirecard reads like a financial ghost tale. The bigger the lie, the harder it becomes to see, because people stop looking. Regulators feared damaging a national champion, auditors feared losing a lucrative client, investors feared missing the next tech rocket, and so a vacuum of almost €2 billion passed as solid fact for half a decade. Only when a diligent reporter, a skeptical auditor, and a clerk in Manila compared notes did the emptiness echo loud enough to shatter the facade. Tonight, the silver letters have been removed from the Munich tower, leaving only faint outlines against the glass. Commuters pass without glancing up, but the building keeps a silent vigil, a reminder that numbers can be forged, signatures copied, and trust, once spent, is harder to locate than a missing €1.9 billion. The Ghost of Silicon Valley, Elizabeth Holmes and the Theranos Illusion. In the heart of Silicon Valley, where innovation is currency and image can outweigh substance, Elizabeth Holmes rose like a star. With her black turtlenecks, piercing gaze, and husky, calculated voice, she modeled herself after Steve Jobs. She promised a healthcare revolution, technology that could test for hundreds of diseases using just a single drop of blood. Her company, Theranos, was valued at over $9 billion. Investors lined up. Politicians, military generals, and media moguls joined her board. But there was one critical flaw: the technology didn't work. Elizabeth Holmes dropped out of Stanford at 19 with a vision. She wanted to eliminate the pain and inefficiency of traditional blood testing. With a few drops from a finger prick, her device, called the Edison, would diagnose everything from cancer to cholesterol levels in real time. It sounded like science fiction, but Holmes claimed it was already science fact. She was convincing. Backed by her youth, confidence, and compelling origin story, Holmes raised hundreds of millions of dollars from influential investors. Rupert Murdoch, the Walton family, and Betsy DeVos all bought in. Former Secretary of State George Shultz joined the board. So did retired Marine General James Mattis. But inside Theranos, engineers and scientists were panicking. The Edison machines didn't work. They gave wildly inaccurate results, often failing basic quality checks. When tests were run on real patients, the company secretly used traditional lab equipment, disguising the process to look automated. Staff were pressured into silence. Those who questioned the technology were fired or threatened with lawsuits. Still, Holmes pushed forward. She secured deals with Walgreens and Safeway to roll out Theranos devices in stores across the country. The media hailed her as the world's youngest self-made female billionaire. She graced magazine covers, spoke at tech conferences, and even gave a TED Talk. All the while, Theranos was built on deception. The house of cards began to wobble in 2015, when Wall Street Journal reporter John Carreyrou began investigating the company. Using whistleblower accounts from former employees, he published a series of damning exposés. Theranos was not only lying about its capabilities, it was putting patients at risk with faulty test results. Holmes denied everything. She went on television, gave interviews, and accused critics of trying to stifle innovation. But the evidence was piling up. Federal regulators launched investigations. Walgreens and other partners cut ties. Patients who had received false diagnoses filed lawsuits. In 2016, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services banned Holmes from owning or operating a lab for 2 years. Theranos voided thousands of test results. Its value plummeted. By 2018, the company dissolved. That same year, Holmes and former Theranos president Ramesh Sunny Balwani were charged with multiple counts of wire fraud and conspiracy. Prosecutors claimed they had deliberately misled investors and patients while knowing the technology didn't work. Holmes maintained her innocence. The courtroom drama stretched on for years. In 2022, Holmes was found guilty on 4 counts of fraud. Her carefully curated persona, once the symbol of disruption and genius, had crumbled under cross-examination. She was sentenced to over 11 years in prison. Balwani received an even longer sentence, nearly 13 years. Theranos had raised more than $700 million. It promised to change the world, and for a while, people believed it had. But in the end, it was a facade, propped up by secrecy, marketing, and the allure of a perfect solution. What made the fraud so chilling wasn't just the money lost, it was the betrayal of trust in medicine, in science, and in hope. Real patients relied on Theranos test results. Some delayed treatment, others panicked over false alarms. The consequences were not just financial, they were deeply personal. Elizabeth Holmes became a symbol, not just of fraud, but of what happens when image eclipses truth. In Silicon Valley, where "fake it till you make it" is often celebrated, she took the mantra too far. Her fall from grace serves as a reminder that even in a world chasing innovation, some lines cannot be crossed. And when they are, the fallout isn't just reputational, it's human. The crimson drop of Silicon Valley. Palo Alto mornings often begin with a gentle haze that lifts just as the cafes fill with engineers discussing seed rounds. In 2003, a 19-year-old Stanford dropout named Elizabeth Holmes joined that ritual with an idea she described in breathless terms. A single drop of blood, drawn from a painless finger prick, could run hundreds of laboratory tests in minutes. Investors heard a note of Steve Jobs-like certainty in her low, unhurried voice. Professors noticed how quickly she brushed aside questions about feasibility. She called her company Theranos, from the words therapy and diagnosis, an alchemy title that promised healing and revelation in one sweep. Holmes cultivated an image that felt engineered for devotion. She lowered her voice to a baritone that sounded oddly deliberate, wore black turtlenecks, and spoke of democratizing healthcare with such conviction that seasoned venture capitalists nodded as though she were reciting manifest destiny. By 2010, Theranos had slipped into the bloodstream of Silicon Valley money. Larry Ellison, Rupert Murdoch, and the family offices of former secretaries of state all wrote 8-figure checks. The company's valuation climbed past $9 billion, turning Holmes, on paper, into the world's youngest self-made female billionaire. Inside the glass cube on Page Mill Road, the atmosphere could be both electric and suffocating. New hires were told they were changing the future. They were also reminded that discussing technology outside the building would invite termination and lawsuits. Engineers noticed that the prototype machines, sleek beige boxes nicknamed Edisons, struggled to deliver consistent results even on trivial tests like potassium levels. Chemists warned that fingerstick blood could clot before analysis, skewing numbers wildly. One scientist likened the device to a jet engine stuck in a shoebox. Yet every time frustration rose, Holmes gathered the staff in a bright atrium, blue eyes gleaming, and assured them that this is just an engineering problem and we're the best in the world. The best in the world, however, needed data that looked perfect. According to former lab workers, quality control flags were overridden in software so that machines would print tidy results. When outside partners, most notably Walgreens, asked for verification, Theranos flew in carefully stage-managed demonstrations. Samples were whisked away to a hidden floor where conventional Siemens analyzers, not the magical Edison, did the real testing. Executives referred to this sleight of hand as doing it on the big machines, a phrase uttered with the hush of a confessional. Trouble gathered in faint ripples. A pathologist in Tennessee noticed that Theranos vitamin D readings contradicted hospital labs by wide margins. A doctor in Arizona treated a patient for heart arrhythmia after a Theranos potassium result suggested danger, only to learn later that the number was wrong. Most alarming, proficiency testing samples that Theranos should have run on its own devices were secretly split. One half went into the Edison, the other half into a standard analyzer to ensure compliance scores. Splitting was forbidden by federal lab rules, but the workaround kept regulators at bay. Everything turned on a phone call placed by Tyler Schultz, a nervous 20-something researcher and, awkwardly, the grandson of board member George Schultz. He told Wall Street Journal reporter John Carreyrou that inside Theranos, fear trumped science. Carreyrou listened, skeptical but intrigued, and began tracing leads. He learned that lab directors resigned after warning Holmes directly. One ex-employee had been sued for millions after mentioning problems to a friend. Another colleague, distressed by data manipulation, had taken his own life. His family kept silent, bound by non-disclosure agreements. In October 2015, the journal published Carreyrou's first article, asserting that Theranos used traditional machines for most tests and that its Edison device handled only a tiny fraction. Holmes appeared the same evening on CNBC, voice steady, eyes unblinking, labeling the story factually and scientifically erroneous. She promised proof. The proof never arrived. Instead, federal inspectors from the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services descended on the Palo Alto lab. They found uncalibrated equipment, expired reagents, and quality logs rewritten after the fact. A memo concluded that Theranos deficiencies posed immediate jeopardy to patient health. Investors, once enchanted, sought clarification. Board members, former admirals, senators, and diplomats, lacked the technical literacy to interrogate Holmes' explanations. Meanwhile, Walgreens froze its nationwide rollout and eventually sued. Partner hospitals tore out Theranos kiosks before dawn so patients wouldn't notice their disappearance. The valuation fell as sharply as it had risen, until employees joked bitterly that each press release cost $1 billion. Holmes and her chief operating officer, the stern and secretive Ramesh Sunny Balwani, insisted that setbacks were temporary. They spoke of a new, improved analyzer called Minilab, but demonstrations again relied on offstage equipment. In 2016, regulators banned both Holmes and Balwani from owning or operating a laboratory for 2 years. By 2018, Theranos laid off its last scientist, sold laboratory furniture at auction, and filed for dissolution. The company that had promised to revolutionize medicine left behind only empty benches and a pallet of unopened syringes. Prosecutors moved next. A federal grand jury indicted Holmes and Balwani on charges of wire fraud and conspiracy to commit wire fraud against investors and patients. Court filings painted a portrait of willful misrepresentation. Optimistic timelines recast as current capabilities, patient data cherry-picked to hide failures, and a board dazzled by narrative rather than numbers. During her trial, Holmes' defense argued that she genuinely believed in the mission, that missteps were part of innovative risk-taking. Jurors heard recordings of her assuring investors that the devices were deployed on military medevac helicopters, a claim unsupported by any military branch. In January 2022, Holmes was found guilty on 4 counts and later sentenced to more than 11 years in prison. Balwani received nearly 13. When the courthouse lights dimmed and spectators filed out, the echo that lingered was not rage but a softer emotion, bewilderment at how hope can bend reality until it breaks. Holmes had tapped a well of longing, the desire for simple solutions, for heroes who speak in clear, dramatic phrases. In the glow of that longing, questions blurred. By the time clarity returned, tens of thousands of patients had received lab reports printed on the letterhead of a dream. On quiet nights, the emptied Theranos headquarters still reflects the sodium lamps of Page Mill Road, a mute mirror to passing cars. Security guards paced the lobby once designed to impress dignitaries, their footsteps the only sound. Silicon Valley moves on, vowing never to be fooled again, until the next perfect pitch written in the ink of certainty sets hearts racing faster than hard numbers ever could. The billionaire mirage, Alan Stanford and the Caribbean Ponzi scheme. At first glance, Sir Alan Stanford appeared to be the embodiment of American success. With his salt and pepper beard, Texan charm, and a private jet fleet stamped with his personal crest, he commanded the room like a man born to power. He hosted lavish cricket tournaments, donated to universities, shook hands with presidents, and was even knighted by the Antiguan government. His empire, the Stanford Financial Group, promised safety and sophistication to thousands of investors around the world. At the heart of it was a seemingly simple offer: high-yield certificates of deposit, CDs, issued through his offshore bank in Antigua, offering returns far above any American bank. What few knew was that the money was never being invested. It was fueling a fraud that would become the second largest Ponzi scheme in U.S. history. Stanford's pitch was irresistible to many. The CDs, marketed through his subsidiary Stanford International Bank, offered steady returns of 10% or more, supposedly derived from a mix of conservative foreign investments and real estate holdings. The company claimed transparency, safety, and elite banking practices. He built trust through appearances. His Houston offices were dripping in marble. His staff wore uniforms. Clients received glossy brochures and detailed reports outlining portfolio strength and security. He sponsored sports events, political campaigns, and public health programs. It all looked real. By the early 2000s, Stanford controlled more than $7 billion in investor assets. Most of it came from retirees, middle-class professionals, and even churches who had been told their money was being carefully managed overseas. But inside the Stanford empire, it was chaos. The CDs were a lie. Stanford and his inner circle weren't investing the deposits. Instead, they were using the funds to pay earlier investors, classic Ponzi behavior, and to finance Stanford's lavish lifestyle. He purchased private islands, operated a fleet of jets, and lived in a massive estate in the Caribbean. He surrounded himself with models, hosted private parties for celebrities, and claimed he was too big to fail. As the scheme grew, so did his delusions of grandeur. He presented himself as a banking innovator and philanthropic leader. In 2006, he donated millions to promote cricket in the West Indies, famously awarding a $20 million prize to the winning team of a single match. Cameras flashed. Athletes cheered. The illusion deepened. But the cracks began to form as early as 2008, during the global financial crisis. Investors wanted to pull out their money, and Stanford couldn't deliver. Rumors spread. Whistleblowers began talking. A former employee alerted the SEC, describing in detail how the CD program was fabricated. The SEC launched an investigation. In February 2009, the House of Cards collapsed. Stanford was arrested and charged with orchestrating a $7 billion fraud. Prosecutors described his company as a massive Ponzi scheme, one that preyed on trust, appearance, and a network of complicit financial advisors. In court, Stanford denied everything. He claimed the company was legitimate, the investments real, and the charges politically motivated. But the evidence was overwhelming. Emails, financial statements, and testimony from former executives made it clear. The CDs were worthless, the returns fabricated, and the books cooked for years. In 2012, Alan Stanford was convicted on 13 counts, including fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. He was sentenced to 110 years in federal prison. The fallout was devastating. More than 21,000 investors across 113 countries lost life savings. Many had been lured in by glowing recommendations from advisors who were paid to push Stanford's products. The Antiguan economy, once bolstered by Stanford's investments, plunged into financial crisis. His knighthood was revoked. His assets were seized. And his name, once tied to prestige, became synonymous with deception. Unlike Bernie Madoff, who expressed some remorse for his crimes, Stanford maintained his innocence to the end. Even in prison, he insisted he was a victim of government overreach. But the numbers told a different story: billions gone, lives shattered, and a decade-long fraud that operated behind the smoke and mirrors of one man's ego. Stanford's case exposed glaring weaknesses in international banking oversight. His operations in Antigua were largely unregulated, and his American branches functioned with minimal scrutiny. By spreading his empire across jurisdictions, he had stayed one step ahead, until he couldn't. In the end, Alan Stanford didn't just steal money. He stole security, hope, and trust. He created a fantasy, then sold it to the world. And for a time, the world believed him. The Velvet Elevator on Lexington Avenue. Midtown Manhattan keeps its secrets behind mirrored glass, and few facades were as quietly reflective as Lipstick Building at 53rd Street in Lexington. On the tower's 17th floor, behind a discreet bronze plaque reading Bernard L. Madoff Investment Securities, a velvet-lined elevator opened onto pale carpets and hushed receptionists. Visitors saw nothing amiss: soft yellow lamps, tasteful watercolors, the faint scent of cedar polish. The man who floated through this calm was Bernard Madoff himself, silver-haired, tireless, and unhurried, the embodiment of Wall Street gravitas without its bluster. Clients spoke of him as if invoking a talisman. Schools in Boston, hospitals in Palm Beach, pension funds in Madrid, all claimed seats in Bernie's exclusive fund. He accepted money the way an art dealer releases limited prints, selectively, hinting there simply was not room for everyone. Annual statements glided into mailboxes each January, promising returns that never looked outrageous, just uncannily consistent. 9 to 12%, rain or shine, recession or boom. Advisors called it the split-strike conversion strategy. Few could explain the mechanics, but the results soothed any doubt. Beneath the 17th floor, however, was another realm. A freight elevator, requiring a special key, descended to floor 17 and a half, an architectural oddity never listed on public blueprints. Here, fluorescent tubes buzzed over metal desks where a handful of employees printed trade confirmations that had never passed through an exchange. Dot matrix printers spat out fictitious order numbers. Backdated trades were typed in by hand, each day's ink a ticket to the next. Paper stacked in fire-resistant cabinets, creating the illusion of activity for any auditor polite enough to glance but not probe. The charade might have spun forever had curiosity not stirred on the opposite side of the Atlantic. In early 1999, a French derivatives expert named Harry Markopoulos sat in a Boston cubicle comparing hedge fund performance. A colleague asked whether they could replicate Madoff's strategy for their clients. Markopoulos ran the math and felt a chill. The options positions required to deliver such smooth gains would exceed all listed trading volume on the Chicago Board Options Exchange. In other words, if Madoff were doing what he said, every trader in America would have noticed. He drafted an 8-page memo titled, "The World's Largest Ponzi Scheme," mailed it to the Securities and Exchange Commission, and waited. The SEC thanked him and filed the letter. Twice more over 7 years, Markopoulos submitted thicker dossiers, each charting impossible volumes, inconsistencies in custody arrangements, and red flags in auditor credentials. The agency opened limited inquiries, asked Madoff for explanations, then closed the cases with nothing more than handwritten notes. No evidence inconsistent with customer statements. Madoff supplied the data himself. No one subpoenaed counterparties. Inspectors later admitted they were intimidated by his reputation and by the complexity they assumed must exist under the hood. Meanwhile, whispers surfaced in Europe. Fund-of-fund managers in Luxembourg wondered why Madoff never attended industry conferences. An analyst in Geneva noticed that during violent market downturns, after September 11th, during the 2002 dot-com collapse, Madoff accounts showed minor gains as if insulated by a private law of physics. Still, those returns paid school tuitions and bought beach houses. Curiosity dimmed when statements arrived on time. Then came September 2008. Lehman Brothers fell like a mortared brick, credit froze, and investors everywhere rushed to retrieve cash. Redemption requests hit Madoff's office in waves, heavier each week. In November alone, he needed to wire out $7 billion. Available balance was scarcely a fraction. On the evening of December 10th, in his penthouse on East 64th Street, Madoff poured 2 glasses of scotch and summoned his sons, Mark and Andrew. He confessed the unimaginable: "It's all one big lie." The sons listened, stunned, then sought legal counsel and reported their father to federal authorities before dawn. When FBI agents arrived the next morning, Madoff sat in a leather chair as if expecting old friends. He wore charcoal slippers and a tired half-smile. Asked whether there was an innocent explanation, he shook his head. "There is no business," he said softly. Arrest followed, swift and almost anticlimactic. The man who once chaired the Nasdaq was led past cameras and handcuffs, his eyes downcast but dry. Investigators peeled back the scheme like wallpaper gone brittle. Client statements listed $65 billion in assets. Actual holdings were barely a few hundred million, mostly parked in a Chase account earning mundane interest. The deception dated to the early 1990s, perhaps earlier, nourished by fresh investments that paid off departing ones in classic Ponzi fashion. Feeder funds, from Fairfield Greenwich in New York to Banco Santander's private banking arm in Spain, had channeled fortunes his way, clipping small fees while outsourcing due diligence to faith. Among the victims were Holocaust survivors, retired teachers, and the Wilpon family, owners of the New York Mets. A charitable foundation honoring Nobel laureate Elie Wiesel lost everything. Universities froze scholarships overnight. The emotional toll defied spreadsheets. Trust itself seemed bankrupt. At sentencing, elderly investors recounted selling homes, going back to work, or postponing medical treatment. Judge Denny Chin called Madoff's crimes extraordinarily evil, imposing a 150-year sentence, symbolic yet cathartic to those who watched their years of savings vanish into a vacuum. In the months that followed, court-appointed trustee Irving Picard traced funds through shell companies in Gibraltar, feeder funds in Bermuda, and Swiss accounts hidden behind numbered facades. By clawing back fictitious profits, money some investors had withdrawn blissfully before the collapse, Picard recovered over $14 billion, a rare partial victory in the aftermath of financial catastrophe. Still, many victims saw pennies on the dollar, and never would the monthly envelopes with steady gains appear on their kitchen tables again. Today, the Lipstick Building's 17th floor hosts another firm, its reception modernized, the cedar scent replaced by citrus. The secret half-floor below lies empty, lights removed, doors sealed with drywall. Passers-by pause at the lobby plaque, now blank metal, unaware of the phantom elevator that once carried cardboard boxes filled with counterfeit trades. Wall Street carries on, promising lessons have been learned, yet insiders trade a rueful saying, "Consistency is the scariest number." Few recall who coined it, but its shadow lingers each time returns arrive, too perfect, too serene, like a velvet elevator ascending without cables into the heart of Manhattan twilight. The flickering lights of Houston. Houston's skyline gleams brightest after sundown, when the mirrored towers along Smith Street glow like upright lanterns. At the turn of the millennium, the tallest and most radiant belonged to Enron, a company that promised to light the world by trading not just natural gas and electricity but, as its executives like to say, pure energy itself. Commuters driving the Katy freeway could see the corporate logo pulsing in sapphire neon, an emblem of Texas optimism and deregulated ambition. Inside, the atmosphere felt almost collegiate. Open floors, glass cubicles, employees in jeans tossing Nerf footballs while screens streamed market data faster than anyone could blink. Executives encouraged what they called loose-tight culture. Casual in dress, ruthless in targets. If an idea couldn't be monetized within 6 months, it was dropped. If it could, the champion received stock options that minted millionaires overnight. Analysts dubbed Enron the most innovative company in America 6 years in a row, and its CEO, Jeffrey Skilling, soaked in the praise with a quick grin that never quite reached his eyes. Behind the charisma, however, numbers strained to keep up with rhetoric. Enron's core gas trading business delivered real profits, but nowhere near the hyper-growth Wall Street had been promised. To bridge the gap, Chief Financial Officer Andrew Fastow designed a latticework of special-purpose entities, shell companies with names like LJM and Raptors. These entities bought underperforming Enron assets at inflated prices, booked gains on the parent company's balance sheet, and hid corresponding losses behind a curtain of off-balance sheet debt. Fastow pocketed finders' fees, auditors ticked through checklists, and quarterly earnings appeared as smooth as polished marble. Red flags did flutter. A young accountant asked why every deal closed in the final hours of each quarter. A risk manager noticed that market-to-market valuations always drifted upward, never down, as though gravity itself had been renegotiated. When she raised concerns, a superior advised her to stop acting like a cop and focus on closing trades. Promotions went to those who executed, not those who questioned. Skilling's most audacious project emerged in 2000, Enron Broadband Services, an online marketplace for leasing and used fiber optic capacity. The venture had no functioning platform, yet Skilling promised it would do for bandwidth what eBay did for collectibles. At a lavish analyst conference in the Renaissance Hotel, engineers demoed a streaming video of a parrot flapping its wings in real time. What the audience didn't know was that the feed ran on a closed local network. The global backbone was nowhere near ready. Still, the stock jumped on cue, and employees clipped the parrot's image into celebratory emails. Meanwhile, in a small cubicle at Fortune magazine, reporter Bethany McLean studied Enron's latest 10K filing. A former Goldman Sachs analyst, she admired the company's swagger but couldn't reconcile its climbing market cap with its razor-thin cash flow. In March 2001, she published a politely worded article titled, "Is Enron Overpriced?" A pebble tossed into the gulf that went mostly unnoticed. Enron's head of investor relations called McLean unethical, and suggested she simply didn't get it. Yet doubt, once seeded, tends to sprout. Short sellers combed through the same SEC filings and traced the labyrinth of Fasto's entities. Some discovered that Enron guaranteed those shells with its own stock, an arrangement that could implode if prices fell. In August 2001, Skilling abruptly resigned for personal reasons, leaving founder Ken Lay to reassure analysts that nothing fundamental had changed. Behind closed doors, Lay urged employees to keep buying the stock, even as he offloaded millions of dollars worth of his own shares. The market finally blinked in October when Enron announced a mysterious $1.2 billion equity reduction linked to related party transactions. 12 days later, the company restated 5 years of earnings, wiping out nearly $600 million in reported profit. Credit agencies slashed ratings to near junk. Trading partners, suddenly wary, demanded cash collateral for contracts that had long been secured by Enron's reputation alone. Each day, Treasury staff wired out tens of millions more than came in, the corporate equivalent of a hemorrhage. Employees felt the shift first in the building's cafeteria, where the mood turned from high fives to hollow jokes about resumes. Darla, a payroll specialist, noticed that executives who once swaggered through the lobby now slipped out side doors carrying cardboard boxes. On November 30th, Dynegy withdrew from a last-minute rescue merger, citing unresolved issues. 4 days later, Enron filed for Chapter 11, the largest bankruptcy in American history at that time. Revelations followed with the relentlessness of dripping water. Arthur Andersen, Enron's auditor, had shredded boxes of working papers after learning the SEC was sniffing around. The firm collapsed under obstruction of justice charges. Fasto pled guilty to fraud and became the prosecution's star witness, detailing how he manipulated spreadsheets so lenders never saw the same debt twice. Skilling was convicted on 19 counts of conspiracy and securities fraud. Lay was found guilty as well, though he died of a heart attack before sentencing. Thousands of employees, whose retirement savings were locked almost entirely in Enron stock, watched nest eggs dissolve to pennies while executives retained bonuses paid weeks before the crash. Congress promised reforms, delivering the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, a statute that now governs every public company's internal controls. Critics argue that paperwork multiplied but human nature stayed the same. Houston's economy rebounded, its skyline still brilliant, yet older residents point to the vacant floor numbers in certain elevators, the ones Enron once filled, and remember nights when the city glowed a little too brightly. Years later, a former trader returned to the now leased office space and rode the glass elevator silently to the 49th floor. The walls had been repainted, the trading desks removed, but if he closed his eyes he could almost hear the old chorus of ringing phones, the shouted bids, the confident laughs echoing down the aisles. Then he opened them, saw only sunlight on clean carpet, and understood that confidence, unmoored from truth, flickers like a bulb before it burns out. Tonight, drivers along the Katy freeway still see towers lit in neon, but none bear the Enron E. The skyline endures, steadier, perhaps wiser, yet mindful of the season when a company tried to trade energy's future and instead became a cautionary tale whispered wherever quarterly numbers look a shade too polished to be entirely real. The Swiss Bank Heist, The Art of Deception by Gerard Tessin. Switzerland has long been synonymous with banking secrecy, stability, and trust. Its banks, nestled in the shadow of the Alps, have served as guardians of some of the world's largest fortunes. The polished marble halls of Geneva and Zurich hold billions in assets, with privacy assured as a fundamental right. For many wealthy clients, Swiss banks represent security and discretion. But even in this fortress of financial confidence, cracks can appear. sometimes carved by the very people entrusted to protect it. Gerard Tesson was one such individual. A French-born accountant with impeccable credentials, he joined a prestigious Swiss private bank in Geneva in the early 2000s. His role was ostensibly straightforward: to manage complex client portfolios, advise ultra-wealthy customers on their investments, and maintain the bank's reputation for discretion and reliability. But Tesson was not content with merely doing his job. Over time, he grew increasingly emboldened. With privileged access to client accounts and internal banking systems, he began crafting an elaborate scheme to steal from the very clients he was supposed to serve. What made Tesson's fraud so insidious was its complexity and subtlety. Unlike brazen theft or obvious embezzlement, Tesson worked quietly behind the scenes, exploiting his deep knowledge of accounting, auditing, and Swiss banking protocols to cover his tracks. He created fictitious accounts in the names of shell companies, carefully layered with false documents and forged signatures. Transactions were routed through an intricate network of offshore entities in Europe and the Caribbean, designed to obscure the origin and destination of funds. By manipulating the bank's internal records, Tesson masked unauthorized withdrawals and asset transfers as legitimate investment activity. For years, the scheme went unnoticed. Client statements appeared accurate and balanced, and Tesson's colleagues regarded him as meticulous and trustworthy. Even internal audits failed to detect the irregularities. The forged documents and expertly falsified reports gave no cause for suspicion. The total amount stolen grew into the hundreds of millions, with estimates exceeding $150 million. The funds financed an opulent lifestyle far removed from the humble accountant's beginnings. Luxury homes, high-end vehicles, and investments in art and real estate all flowed from the illicit gains. Yet no deception lasts forever. The first sign of trouble emerged when a newly appointed compliance officer spotted subtle discrepancies in client account statements during a routine review. Certain wire transfers did not match corresponding records. Some signatures on documents appeared inconsistent. These small flags prompted a deeper investigation. Swiss financial authorities quickly became involved, coordinating with law enforcement agencies in France, the Caribbean, and elsewhere. The tangled web of shell companies and cross-border transfers made the probe challenging and lengthy. In 2010, after months of surveillance and forensic accounting, Gerard Tesson was arrested at his home in France. His computers and personal files contained mountains of fabricated documents, spreadsheets, and emails detailing the cover-up. At trial, prosecutors painted a picture of a man who used his professional expertise to betray trust on a grand scale. Tesson maintained he had started with good intentions but had become ensnared in a spiral of greed and deception. The court sentenced him to over 10 years in prison, marking one of the most significant private banking fraud convictions in Swiss history. The repercussions were profound. The scandal damaged the reputation of Swiss private banking, once considered untouchable. It triggered regulatory reforms aimed at increasing transparency, strengthening compliance, and imposing stricter oversight on account managers and back-office operations. Clients became more cautious, demanding better audits and verification. Banks began collaborating more closely with international authorities to prevent money laundering and financial crimes. Gerard Tesson's story is a stark reminder that even the most trusted institutions are vulnerable when ambition and greed intersect with opportunity. It illustrates how a single individual, armed with skill and insider access, can exploit systemic weaknesses to devastating effect. More than a crime of numbers, it is a tale of betrayal, of trust shattered behind the velvet curtains of privilege. In the world of high finance, where millions change hands in seconds, vigilance remains the only defense against the art of deception.